Okay, we continue working with char arrays or C strings. Passing C strings to functions is yet another concept that is a very important concept that you need to understand. So functions with C string parameters, that's the same thing, passing C strings to functions. So functions, this is the Zybook section. So it talks about how you pass a char array to a function. So in this case, you're modifying a string. We are passing it from main. User string is created with 50 characters. You read into it using getLine, and then you are converting all the spaces to hyphens. So that a function is doing that. And then we are printing it in main. So you call this function that says string space to hyphen and send your string to it. You receive it here. Notice the way you receive it, just like a regular char array, no ampersand sign, nothing. But by default, the char array is being passed by reference. And in here, you go through a for loop and you check every single character. If it's a space, you change it to a dash. You're not returning anything. It's a void function. So what this tells you is by default, all char arrays, you don't have a choice. All char arrays are passed by reference. And why does it not have an ampersand sign? That is the most important question, and that is an important concept for you to understand for char arrays and then in future for all arrays. So I have more examples here. If you go to the next section where I have C string parameters as examples, here is an example that talks about you're just getting user input. That's all it is. So remember the name and subject that we read from the user. What I have here is two char arrays, name and subject, to read user input from the user. And I call this read string function. So I have two functions. One is called read string and the other is called read int. So the read string, as the name suggests, is used to read a string, which is a char array, from the user. So this read string function takes two char arrays. There are several things that we're going to learn in this example. So the main creates two char arrays called name and subject. First, I call the read string and send name to it and a prompt to it. Notice the prompt is sent as a literal prompt, which means it's sent inside double quotes. And if you look at my function heading, here's my function heading. I got two char arrays that it receives it into. The prompt comes into this array called prompt, and the name, which is empty in main, comes here into temp string. And we output the prompt to the user. We read whatever they enter into temp string. Remember, this temp string is being passed by reference from main, so we don't have to return anything. Here's a better way to understand this. I'm going to copy this code and put it for you in our Python tutor. If you remember, Python tutor helps us visualize our code. So this also will help us understand its limitations. Python tutor will not take such long pieces of code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of my read int here, and I'm going to get rid of the read int function, because otherwise it becomes too long, it doesn't like it. The other thing I'm also going to modify here is 101 characters is way too many. I'm going to make it 21 characters. Okay. All right. So then let's also comment out. We want to read an integer, which is fine. We just need to read two strings. Okay. So now if you go down and say visualize execution, it takes a minute to get the code set up. Okay. The most important thing that I want you to see here is how this char array is being passed by reference. Okay, so here's main. I have a constant. Here's my const. Notice we have stack and heap part of the memory. All our automatic variables that you create so far are all created on the stack. Heap is used for dynamic memory, meaning during runtime memory allocation. And you will see more of this as we end 161B and as you get into 162. We have two char arrays, and that's what you see here, name and subject, and they all have question marks in them. They have 21 characters. Notice we have indices that go from 0 to 21. And I have an int variable at the bottom that's a score where there's nothing. So let's step next at the bottom. Next, score gets set to 0. I'm on line 26, executing line 26. It's going to call this function called read string. It's going to take that literal string, enter student's name in double quote, and copy it into prompt. Notice what happens with the stack and the heap. When I hit next, we are in the function. Notice now we are in the function and we got memory allocated here. And we have a prompt and temp string. And notice they're pointers. Okay, so the name of the array is really a pointer. Even though I did not use any pointers here, internally, the name of the array is a pointer. A pointer is a data type that simply stores an address. So prompt is going to store an address. Temp string is going to store an address. But whose address? So let's hit next. And notice now we have arrows going from the prompt and temp string. Prompt is pointing to that text called enter student's name, which is my prompt. That's my literal string. Okay, I guess I lost my execution now. So prompt is essentially pointing to that literal string, which is, again, notice it's on the heap. It's not on the stack. It's on the heap because it's an actual literal string without any variable. It's just copying a literal string into this parameter called prompt. And notice temp string is a pointer, but it's really pointing to name. Because if you look on line 26, the function call passed the literal string and the variable name, which is coming in by reference to line 42 into temp string. So temp string is really a pointer that is looking at name. And so if I hit next, here's another limitation that I'm going to hit now. It's not going to let me read anything from the input, which is fine. Okay, so if at that line 47, ideally, if it waited for user input, then it would wait for me to read something, but it doesn't. Instead, it puts a null character there. That is a limitation of Python tutor. So we won't worry about putting any user input, which is okay. And then you hit next, function ends, it goes back, and we are on line 28. We're going to call the next function call. It's the same function, but I want to enter the subject now, right? So I hit next, and notice it comes into the function. Now, again, prompt and temp string are pointers. They're not pointing to anything yet, but if I hit next, notice prompt points to this string here that says enter the subject, because now that's what I passed to it, and temp string is the pointer pointing to subject, not name anymore, because our function call on line 28 passes subject to it now. Same function. Really, that's how it should be, right? The same function. We shouldn't have different functions. It's the same function to read a string. We just pass different parameters to it. This is very important. So now temp string is pointing to subject, and ideally, if I could read input in, I would be putting something in there that says comp science, but it's not going to let me put anything in because of the way Python tutor works. I'm going to show you in Replit how this is going to work in a minute. And it reads into subject, and then it goes back to main, and the printing happens in main now. It says cout, name, and subject, separated by whatever, and right now my score is empty. Okay, so the visualization here that I want to show you is how the two pointers, how the two charArrays get copied over as parameters, as pointers, really. And each time you pass it, it's a different thing. One time we are passing, one time we are pointing to name, and the next time we are pointing to subject. Okay. Now you could very well do this. And if you go back to my Zybooks, it says this. Notice up here, the name of the array is a constant pointer. I didn't spell pointer right there. In other words, the name of the array points to the first character of the array, which is what you were saying, is that temp string was really pointing to name or subject, the first character in those arrays. That's what we were doing. Okay, so for example, I could go back and change this to a pointer, which is all it is internally. And you're going to see a lot of this as we go through in a lot of functions and when we get to the pointers chapter. So this is saying temp string is a pointer, which is really what we did before as well. It's just that the square bracket syntax is used there instead of the pointer. But this will be a little bit better because as you go through and you're going to write other programs and you're going to see functions, they all have the pointer syntax more than the actual square bracket syntax. And so when you see error messages, you'll see a lot of const char error messages because that's just how internally the name of the array is referred to as a constant pointer. Okay, so now when this function runs, it's not going to be any different from what you saw before, but I'm going to try it again. Instead of passing it as an array, you're passing it as a pointer, and it works really the same way. So for example, we can go here and let me take this code and put it in here, create a new REPL, and let's see if this ever came back. No, so that's having some trouble, so let's leave that alone. But you can try smaller versions of code in there. So here is the same thing. And so we can change this to a pointer syntax instead of a square bracket syntax. Nothing changes, everything else stays the same, but the name of the array really is a constant pointer. So what happens here is first name gets copied over to temp string, and really what the address gets copied over, and temp string is now pointing to name. The next time temp string is pointing to subject, and so we are passing it by reference. And the important thing to understand is that the name of the array is a constant pointer and it is pointing to the original arrays. Here it's just an address that is sitting there. Nothing more than that. It's just a single block of memory used to just store an address. Okay? So that's how we pass char arrays to functions. And you want to change this as well, by the way. If I change my prototype, that way you keep it all consistent. Okay, there we go. You did have a problem with it before. So you run it, nothing is going to change. The way it works is exactly the same as before, but you have now used the pointer syntax. Okay, and this is very slow. That's why it's not coming up. So I'm going to stop there for right now. Okay, and there you go.